so we can kickstart this panel session. The panel session is titled Digital Austerity, Impact of Digitalization of Essential Services on People, you can imagine. My name is Chloé Berthelemy, and I'm a senior policy advisor at European Digital Rights, and I have the pleasure to guide today's discussion with 6 excellent speakers, and the last one just arrived. Thank you very much for joining us. I will let the speakers introduce themselves in a few minutes, but first I would like to share our intentions for this panel and frame a little bit the debate by providing some key definitions and some elements of context. So for the purpose of this panel, we understand the term essential services as encompassing a broad range of services that are essential, as the name suggests, to the enjoyment of social and economical rights, but also to the participation to civic life, for example. Examples that come to mind are easy education, health, social welfare, financial services, public transportation and administration, access to the job market, etc., etc. The list goes beyond purely public services because digitalization processes do happen in both services that are provided by the states but also by private actors nowadays in sectors which have been partly or fully privatized since the 80s in the last century. The topic that we are addressing and tackling today is of high relevance in 2024 because digitalization is a key priority of the EU and will remain so in the coming years. We are now in the 2nd year of the European Commission's Digital Decade Policy Programme, which was published in December 2022 with a series of targets for the digital transition in Europe. For example, one of these targets is to reach 100% of public services online by 2030. And what we have seen also is EU funding and investing in this digital transition of public services in the past years. We also seen some legislative initiative. So the EU has used its legislative powers, notably with regards to digital identity, for example, or the digitalization of health records. So this is an ongoing process, and we need more public debate about what's going on and what is the direction we want to set. For now, this is kind of part of a wider political agenda of the European Commission on economic growth, competitiveness and innovation, because digitalization processes are often connected with productivity and cost efficiency. Now, unfortunately, what we don't talk often about and what we don't highlight is the negative impact of those digitalization processes. And so what we're going to do today with our speakers is to talk about these impacts on people, especially those already marginalized, those who are discriminated against, and those who are socially excluded. Our intention is to go beyond the so-called digital gap, which is for us traditionally the first step of the critical analysis, but that doesn't go far enough. What we aim to demonstrate today is this digitalization is not about just adding barriers for certain categories of people, but more broadly we aim to show that digitalization reinforces marginalization and poverty. It increases social control and surveillance of people experiencing poverty, notably through automation. And lastly, it restructures fundamentally critical sectors of our society, such as the welfare state, and the power dynamics inside of those sectors. That's very ambitious. But I have 6 knowledgeable speakers with me, which I will ask them kindly to introduce themselves one by one. And we'll start from this side, please.
Hello, good morning. My name is Juliana Santos Valgren, and I'm the director of the European Anti-Poverty Network, EAPN.
Hi everyone, my name is Swazik Beniko. I used to work on algorithmic accountability for the French government, and now I work with civil society organizations working on access to welfare in the French context, on working to do research, capacity building and advocacy on digital issues, and I've also conducted research on the topic for Lighthouse Reports.
Hi everyone, I'm Louise Culot. I work as a policy officer and researcher for Belgian organization Lire Écrire. We are a literacy organization. We train people on the field and we make sure low-educated people have the same opportunities than everyone else. And especially we work on access to essential services, offline access. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Helen Mukiri Smith. I am a researcher and advisor on artificial intelligence and human rights at Amnesty Tech, and I lead research in Denmark on the use of fraud control algorithms by the Danish government for distribution of welfare.
Hi everyone, my name is Nadia Markovic. I work for an NGO called A11 Initiative for Economic and Social Rights. I work as a senior legal advisor there, and our NGO is based in Belgrade, Serbia, and we focus mostly on providing legal support to socially marginalized people and communities.
Good morning everyone, I'm Alex Ajus Saliba, an MEP coming from Malta, and also Vice President in the S&D group responsible for coordination on digital dossiers.
Very important task and role. We all use she, her pronouns except Mr. Saliba, he, him. I just wanted to flag this. How are we going to structure our conversation? We will do first a little bit of contextualization, scene setting with Juliana. Then we'll deep dive into, as you may have heard, our speakers are coming from different member states, so they have unique experience and knowledge about what's going on at national level, how things develop. So we'll hear about some case studies from several countries, and then we'll move on to a discussion about solutions, how we can set the agenda at European level, how do we mobilize on this issue, how do we address the concerns that we're going to raise across the conversation. Does it sound like a good plan? I hope so, because we're not going to change it. So I'll turn first to Juliana. Your organization, the European Network Against Poverty, has recently published a report on the use of digital tools by people experiencing poverty. And in there, you try to tackle the myth that digitalization of essential services is bringing only advantages to people, basically, and leading to better social protection because people do take up their rights, they manage to get access easily, and so on and so forth. Why did you come to this realization that you needed to tackle this dominant narrative?
Yeah, first of all, we are a network of networks. So we are based in Brussels, but we have more than 30 national networks working, getting used to that, working in the field to address poverty. And for us, poverty should be a multidimensional approach, should have a multidimensional approach. So if you work on gender poverty, energy poverty, if you work in silos, you're never going to address the question of the structural and systemic issues of poverty. And therefore, when we enter the assessment of the just transition and how the digital divide was amplifying other barriers to make sure that, would like to make sure that people could access digital welfare, social benefits, essential service. We raised the question, is digitalization improving the lives of people experiencing or not? So we had an assumption. We thought like, well, we believe not, but how to prove it? So we started reflecting just after COVID. So what was, how digitalization or digital poverty was occurring before COVID and after COVID. And our assumption in our study, what we identified is that there was a very quick digitalization of public service and social protection after COVID, but putting the burden on the individual. So welfare states never provide support to people to transit together with this quick digitalization. What we also saw, there was a huge impact on families, especially families with children, trying to survive during COVID. And there were mainly three kind of scenarios with families. So children with no PC, so they were really being prevented from education, or schools that would provide PC but would not provide internet, so how it would work, or the question of the how we're going to share devices at home. So a father and mother would have advice about how you work from home and also provide education from your kids. So what we really identified is there was a lack of an intersectional social economic dimension to the question on how the crisis was being implemented, and that digital poverty was not only the lack of resources, access to internet, but also the gap of digital skills that came together with that. And what we mapped out was that when it comes to social protection, there was a phenomenon that is still the phenomenon today that many of our EP members identified, is that when you don't have access to the digital, you have to pay someone to do it for you. Because with the digitalization, service centers were also closing, even after COVID. So it just became the new normal. So we did not reestablish a case-managed approach or a service approach to the people experiencing poverty. And with that, also after COVID, there was a rapid increase of a cashless society. So everything was turning again in banking, financial system, everything in cards and digital. But when you are working in an informal economy, or when you don't have the possibility to access the digital, because many banks went online. If you have to go to the bank, well, there was a case in our report from our case in Denmark, you have to walk 65 kilometers until you find a bank. For example, in Sweden, there are banks that not accept withdrawal from money anymore. So how you ought not even to cash in money. So how do you survive if you are trapped in a cashless society? And also brought to our attention the question of this multidimension of poverty, also bringing the case of workers and how in-work poverty was also being then affected by digitalization. Digital skills are essential today to access the labor market. So people who had no digital literacy were really being locked out of the labor market. But beyond, many applications today are done online. So if you don't have access to the digital, or you don't have enough digital skills, how are you going to access the labor market? How are you going to have the possibility to really eradicate and alleviate poverty? So it's from this point of perspective that we had then three main findings. That first, there is digital-induced poverty with digitalization. There is also an automation of discrimination by the use of AI, and even worse, because of the ecosystem in which we operate, and with the austerity measures that are in place, social protection is going to be the first social rights to be cut. So how austerity is enabling also, how digitalization is also enabling austerity.
Those are three important key points and trends that we can see with the digitalization. Pointing on the last one, on austerity, like from a structural perspective, like how do you see digitalization impacting the providing of services by the state in the form of a welfare state, basically. How does this fundamentally change social protection as we used to think of from the state?
Yeah, so that's a historical problem. The first rights to be cut are social. You cut on education, you cut on housing, you cut on social protection, you cut on the amount of money that people can get per month, you cut on wages, you cut on income. So this is a reality in Europe today. So, and even worse, with the approval of the Stability and Growth Pact, member states need to cut spending this year. So we are going back to the golden rule that member states, they must limit their budget deficit to 3% of the GDP. So where are they going to cut? They're going to cut on the social. And that's the problem. By cutting on the social, there are public servants that will not be hired anymore to assist people experiencing poverty. They're going to downsize physical facilities, support centers for people to access social workers. And they're going to over-rely on AI as a decision-making process that people should have or not social protection. And that's a concern. And that's what we call that digitalisation is enabling austerity. There is the Council recommendation on minimum income that was approved by the end of 2020, beginning of 2023. There is a point there that says that member states, they should have in-person service for all the beneficiaries needing support from welfare state. But this is non-binding. And we know already that, again, with the budget cuts, these are measures that will be not implemented. So for us, we need to also understand in this multidimensional approach of poverty, also how public spending can impact digitalization.
Absolutely. And when you mentioned the shifting of responsibility from the state to the individual and families and caretakers, I think it leads also it leads us to this question of also how there is this de-responsibilization of the state, but also kind of an opportunity given by digital tools to reinforce certain control over a population that is already over-surveilled, over-controlled. Is there kind of a perspective of social class we could apply to these processes and how the trends we see?
Exactly. So there is this myth that the digitalization is a one-size-fits-all tool, so that everything applies to everyone. And you know that's not the same. Technology is not neutral. So the thing is that even if digitalization is expanding rights to certain groups, they are excluding many communities. And with the question of the AI and how automated algorithms are being produced, this has a huge impact in the welfare state, and I think the other speakers here will explain. If you have no address, if you live in a low-income neighborhood, if you are a solo mother, if you are a migrant, if a person of color, you are considered a group of risk. And if you automate all the decision-making process, if someone should benefit from social protection or not, this will be then a factor to determine if your need is a need, how much you can get, and if you're eligible or not to get it. So because we lost the case managed approach, the way we are dealing with the welfare state, this is increasing for sure inequalities.
Absolutely, and thank you for providing this kind of broad context. I think what you mentioned just now, like other speakers will try to illustrate what you just described and the analysis you provided with us. And I think it's best to start in the country where we all are located, right? So I'll turn to Louise. Louise, your organization is working in Belgium, in Brussels, and in the Belgium region of Wallonia since many, many years. Can you give us a broad picture of the state of play? What is it to access essential services for people in Belgium today? Do you have any statistics?
Yeah, we are in Belgium as a literacy organization since 40 years, and we work on digital issues for 10 years before COVID already, we pointed out that it was problematic for low literate or illiterate people, the increasing use of technologies. And in Belgium, we consider there is 1 person out of 10 that have literacy issues, that struggle with reading and writing. And I think it's a figure that is more or less the same in all of European countries, maybe a bit more in some Eastern countries, maybe a bit more in the Mediterranean region. And in Belgium, we have 35%, it's very general facts for the beginning, so it's about 35% of Belgians that are considered digitally vulnerable. Sorry, it's a very strange word. I will try to say it correctly. And yeah, in terms of comparisons, it's...
Can you explain a little bit what digital vulnerability is according to this barometer?
Yeah, actually, it's a skill shortage of digital skills, and there is, I think, 5. Maybe someone knows it more than me. It's actually European Union reference. You have to have skills in 5 areas in terms of using internet with security, being able to make a research, being creative. And 2 others, yeah. And if you don't have all those skills, then you're considered
digitally vulnerable.
Exactly.
And it's also about like maybe access to material resources, like having a computer, what Juliana was explaining.
Exactly. So 35% of Belgians are now digitally vulnerable. It's 16% in Holland, it's the best country in Europe, and it's 61% in Bulgaria, which is the worst country of Europe. I'm very sorry to use these words. And yeah, so these are general facts. Now, if we want to go into more specific facts, okay, we can say that digital vulnerability is influenced by age, income, and level of education. Okay, so and now if we want to look at the use of online essential services like e-banking, e-administration, of e-commerce, we have really concerning figures, and those figures all come from Le Baromètre de l'Inclusion Numérique. It's a very important document that is published every year. It's published by La Fondation Roi Baudouin, and it's produced by researchers from Ghent University and UCL, I think. So in the last edition of the Baromètre de l'Inclusion Numérique, they really focused on the use of essential services, online essential services, because they see that in terms of connectivity, there is somehow it's getting better. More and more people are connected, have either a smartphone whereas they are connected. So there is an improvement in this case, but we don't have to hide behind these improvements. So they go a bit more specifically into the use of essential online services. And there you see that 43% of people with low school level, so I'm talking about people with maximum the mid-secondary level, do not use e-administration. 43% do not use e-administration. It's only 12% if you go to people with high schools, university degree, okay? And you have 60% of low-educated people not using online health services, and you have 18% not using e-banking services. It's a bit better, okay? So it's important also to relate what Juliana just said, that obviously people with low education level of low income are usually also the one with the lowest income, and are usually then the one that most depend on social welfare to live. But social welfare is, of course, managed by public administration. So if they don't access public administration, they also don't access their rights. And now, let's go to...
Maybe one word about age?
Yeah, exactly, about age. So there is a myth around digital natives that must be deconstructed. Usually we think that young people can use, like they are highly connected, so they should use also maybe online services, which is actually not true. So in Belgium, always in the last baromètre de l'inclusion numérique, it's said that for internet users of 10, so 39%, aged between 16 and 24.
So the young ones.
Yeah. Declare they need help when they have to do an online procedure related to e-banking or e-administration, 39%, okay? For people between 25 and 54, it's 23%. So it's still almost 1 out of 4 people that need help when it goes to online essential services. And for people between 55 and 74, it's 30%. And we have no data about people above 74.
Okay.
Yeah.
Those are really important figures to actually also understand the state of play and how certain kind of presumption we have about the use of online services are actually not true, and more people struggle than we think. You work really much with people affected on the ground. Your organization do provide trainings to illiterate people, people who have really already at risk of being socially excluded and very far away from the state. Do you have any kind of concrete example you can share with us? What does it mean concretely for the lives of those people?
Yeah, I can refer also to cases like similar cases like Juliana reported. For instance, public schooling, which is very important in order to tackle poverty, access to education. In Belgium now, if you want to enroll your children in primary school level, in Brussels, at least in the region of Brussels, you have to enroll online, okay? It's a very complex online formulary you have to fill in a certain at a certain time of the year. It's about 8 months before the beginning of the next school year. So basically, if you are a single mom with literacy issues, it's a struggle. It's such a stress. So what you're going to do, you probably maybe will, I don't know, ask social workers to do it for you. It's going to be busy. Maybe the time will pass and you will lose the normal procedure.
You will pass the deadline.
Yeah, you will pass the deadline. And so what happened? You will have, if you all live in Belgium, that we don't have such an equal school system. Some schools are good, some schools are not good. Obviously, the good schools get packed right from the beginning. So what's happening for people that are not able to enroll within the deadline, they will all go to those worst schools. So it will make schools even worse because and so on and so on. It's going to another problem. So it's a very easy to understand example of what online services can do.
The repercussion in terms of social inequalities are materialized through this type of indirect effect that we can see. This is about kind of accessibility, how this kind of barriers we were talking about in the introduction. But I'd like to focus now, because we have 3 speakers who've been studying automated system and the introduction of those in especially the social welfare sector. And so I'd like us to deep dive a little bit now on the issue of surveillance, how surveillance become so important in this context, and how those who are marginalized, who are facing social exclusion and experiencing poverty, are being over-surveilled through the introduction of automated technologies. And I'll turn first to France, Swazik. Can you describe a little bit the algorithm that was used by the family branch of the French welfare system? how does it work? Just tell us a little bit about what is it meant to do and how decisive was the algorithm in the decision-making processes?
Sure. To tell you a little bit more about this algorithm, I first want to start by telling you the story of a beneficiary. Her name is Juliette. I've interviewed her as part of research I've done, and Juliette is 50 years old. She is a mother. She has 3 children. One of them is 14 years old and lives partly at hers and partly at her ex-husband. She's been divorced for about 5 years. She used to be an at-home mom, and after her divorce, she started struggling a lot. She also struggles holding down a job, and so she has lots of different odd jobs, basically. And to kind of help her get her head out of the water, she started receiving what in France we call RSA, which is the minimum benefit allocation. So she gets about 900 euros a month from the state to help her, which 900 euros, not enough to live comfortably, right? I think this is also important to remember. It's a welcome help, but it's not enough. So Juliette has been on this benefit for about 6 months when she receives a letter telling her that she's going to be controlled. And it tells her to basically prepare all her bank statements from the last 2 years, print them out, prepare her folder, also asks her everything about her family situation, where she lives. She basically has to print out an entire pack of paper, which she also describes as very tedious, right? She doesn't have a printer at home, it's very costly. So she prepares for this. She doesn't really know why she's been selected. And then she, about 2 weeks later, welcomes a CAF, so the French welfare agency, a CAF inspector at her house. And the inspector goes with her through all her bank statements, asking her to justify every single source of income that comes up on the statements, which you can imagine is a very, very invasive and humiliating process as well, having to justify your entire life to someone you don't know. She also is not too worried about it because she has been in touch with the welfare agency since the beginning. And so she is pretty sure everything's in order. But actually, after these 2 hours of being essentially interrogated by this controller, she finds out that she's going to have to repay money. And the money she's going to have to repay is actually money that has been given to her by her siblings to go visit her dying father, who unfortunately died of a very invasive, rapid type of cancer. And a few days later, actually, she receives a very short statement saying, you owe CAF 2,600 euros, which she doesn't have. She is not considered to be a fraudster, but there was a mistake in her file, and she's being asked to repay this money. She actually appealed. She didn't get any answer for a few months until her appeal was rejected, so she's currently still paying off her debt. This story is important because it's actually what we're focusing on here. We're not focusing on digital policy, we're focusing on welfare policy and the concrete impacts that it has on people. What we think happened to Juliette is that she was targeted by an algorithm that has been in place since 2011. So in 2011, the French welfare agency developed a risk scoring algorithm to fight fraud. There's actually 2 narratives. It's either fight fraud or find mistakes. Both of them are conflated. So if you're one of the 13 million households that receives benefits in France, you have a risk score assigned to you that corresponds to the probability that your file will have mistakes, whether they're fraudulent or not. And it's mistakes of overpayments. So if you actually owe money to the welfare agency. Underpayments are detected, but it's actually just kind of a coincidence because they're optimizing for overpayments. And so this list, these risk scores are used to produce a list that will then be used by the controllers, the inspectors, to prioritize controls. So it's the inspectors who decide to trigger the control, but we know, especially from research by sociologist Vincent Dubois, that controllers tend to follow this list, and actually they tend to find mistakes. And these controls are at-home controls, I've told you, and it's over 100,000 people each year who are subjected to these controls. Inspectors don't know the variables that are used in the algorithm. Beneficiaries don't know why they've been targeted, and they don't know actually that an algorithm was used to trigger controls. We know that 70% of these controls, at least in 2021, were triggered by the algorithm.
Can you repeat the number?
70%. Well, actually now, so the welfare agency doesn't communicate on these numbers anymore because the algorithm has become very unpopular. So they used to communicate, but now we can't find any numbers, which is another story. So in 2021, civil society organizations started looking at this, and one of them is La Quadrature du Net, who most of you may know here. And they obtained the source code of the algorithm to try and see what variables were used by the system. And so the algorithm uses about 40 variables. Some of them are interactions with the welfare agency. So if you've contacted the welfare agency the right amount, you're considered less risky. If you've over-contacted or under-contacted, you're considered more risky, for instance. But also social and economic variables, right? So family situation, income, location, how much money you spend on rent, whether you are on disability benefit is also a risk factor. And so the algorithm ends up scoring vulnerable populations higher, including, like in the case of Juliette, single parents, which in France are 85% of single parent households are women. That's basically the scene, and I kind of want to, I think we'll have many different, many similar cases presented, but I kind of wanted to, from that, highlight 3 things that I find interesting, and many more that we'll get to discuss later. But the first one is this conflation of error and fraud, which plays a lot in the opacity surrounding the system, but also in the way we consider beneficiaries. The second one is that the CNAF hides behind statistical objectivity, because it is true that actually the algorithm ends up increasing the number of people who, when controlled, turn out to have errors, mistakes in their files. Not fraud. Fraud is like 0.04% of all money gotten back. So really, fraud is not the issue here. But I also want to focus on mistakes, because these mistakes can also be due to a lack of communication on the part of the agency. So what CNAF is saying is, it's saying, you know, it makes sense because the, vulnerable populations, vulnerable people, have more complex files and are on benefits that are more complex to obtain because they're means-based. So it makes sense that there would be more errors, and so it makes sense statistically that that they would get higher risk scores. To which there's, you know, several arguments we can oppose, a whole discussion on indirect discrimination, but also a whole discussion on, if we stop focusing on the algorithm itself and we focus on the system, why isn't the welfare agency focusing on reducing the mistakes before they happen and instead focusing on controlling them with technology? And I think it just raises a huge question of framing and of how do we approach this as a policy and not as a tech tool. And the last thing I wanted to say, and it's basically kind of a follow-up on my second point, is this issue of digital welfare is part of a much broader issue on welfare. First of all, the French organizations focused on this algorithm, but there's many more little back office elements in the French system that are automated and that have dire consequences on people that we can focus on. But I feel like this narrative of austerity is neither it's reinforced and it's enabled by technology, but it predates, and it's kind of a chicken and egg situation of when we talk about this welfare system, what we're actually fighting, at least what French civil society organizations are fighting on the ground, is of course the use of technology to surveil and to oppress, but also the wider system that controls it, that considers that beneficiaries are undeserving of these benefits, and they have to, and due to that, they can be subjected to undignified things just because, you know, they should feel so lucky that they're receiving these benefits.
Very important last point, indeed, that it's not just about the tools, but it's also the policies behind it. I want to turn to Hélène. You just heard Swazik exposing very comprehensively the French situation. How does it relate to the Danish situation? Are there similarities? Are there differences? Can you tell us what the Danish government put in place?
Thank you, Chloe. So Amnesty Tech has been conducting research since 2022 on Udbetaling Denmark, which is the public authority that's responsible for distribution of social benefits in Denmark. And this particular authority uses fraud control algorithms, so there's similarities to CAF. Just to plug Amnesty Tech, we are actually publishing a report on this, on our findings in coming weeks. And we'll also have a documentary and a comic strip that explains our findings. Today for this panel, I will be drawing on findings from institutions such as the Danish Institute for Human Rights, Justitia, and Lighthouse to discuss the Udbetaling Denmark fraud control algorithm. But our research that will be published shortly will have more extensive and will expand on quite a lot of what the variables that Udbetaling Denmark is using and the direct impact that the fraud control algorithms have on people's human rights. But to answer your question, just to situate Udbetaling Denmark. So Udbetaling Denmark, as I mentioned, is a public authority that is responsible for distributing social benefits, so child benefits, pension benefits, sick pay, study grants in Denmark. And in 2012, they were given the mandate to create algorithms. And as far as we're aware, they use about 60 algorithms. And these algorithms are there to try and find people who are statistically highly likely to commit benefit fraud. And this is part of the government's agenda to digitize the public sector in order to ensure that they can catch what they call welfare cheats, people who are taking advantage of the Danish welfare system, and particularly it's also based on this whole idea of austerity. It's using algorithms will help make it easier to identify cases of fraud, but also it will also help with, as has been clearly evident in public discourses, with keeping outsiders out of the Danish welfare system. So these are racialized groups because there's this whole categorization in Denmark about Western and non-Western Danes. So Western Danes are Danes who are born in Denmark or in a Western country in the US, in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, in Europe. Non-Western Danes are everybody else who's not born in the West, including Canada. So Canada is part of the West, and the US is also part of the West. So there's this whole idea of the narratives behind excluding people who are seen as disproportionately benefiting from the welfare system in Denmark. And so the welfare state or the Danish government is of the view that the best way to do this is to use fraud control algorithms. They'll save time by use of fraud control algorithms. And these fraud, just to describe how it all works, similar to CAF in some ways, the government or Udbetaling Denmark gathers data, large amounts of very sensitive, very intimate data from numerous public databases and also private databases. So public databases, not only from its own databases, which are social not only from its social benefit databases, but it also gathers data from like the civil registration database that has information about your citizenship, your marital status, where you live, where you've moved to, whether you've left the country. It also relies on your civil property database, which shows the number of rooms in your house, where your house is located, how many people are living with you in the same house. It looks at your income tax data, your health data, your data on all the benefits you're on. It's huge, and what they then do is they merge all these different databases and data obtained from other private databases, and they use algorithms on this data to identify who's statistically highly likely of committing fraud. And the variables, we are aware of some of the variables, and we'll discuss those particular variables in our report, in Amnesty's report. But Lighthouse recently published a report that highlighted that nationality is one of the variables that's used by Utbetaling Denmark to determine whether you're likely to commit fraud. Whether you are connected to a non-EU country is a variable, or whether you have family relations in a non-EU country is a variable. So that creates concerns about discrimination, and the fact that there's a lot of extraction of quite a lot of data, it raises concerns about people's privacy and the idea that there's a trading of privacy in order to access benefits, because you have to reveal quite a lot of your data, or you're forced into providing quite a lot of your data without your consent. So questions about, is it necessary to have such massive data extraction and surveillance? Is it proportionate to do so? Is it contrary to the GDPR that this extraction and surveillance is happening? And also then concerns about the targeting of people based on the data that's available to Utbetaling Denmark, and the discriminatory effects that can bring as a result.
How is it likely that this algorithm triggers a control? Is it also looking for errors, like in the French case, or is it like more generally a social score attributed to individuals, and then they're just like trigger examinations more in depth? How does it work?
Yeah, I think it's both, and I, without revealing too much about what's in our report until the report is published, so please keep an eye on that. But it's a bit of both, where you have people who've errors in the receipt of benefits, so who should not have received benefits but is receiving benefits. Okay. And also it's a control, because it then changes your behavior. Its use encourages or pushes someone to changing the way they behave. It almost creates a chilling effect, because you know you're being monitored. So it's a bit of both, I would say.
And since when is this system in place in Denmark, do you know?
So Utbetaling Denmark was established in 2012. And they were given a mandate in the law around the same time. And so I would think the development of the algorithms started around 2012, 2013. And as of 2019, there were about 60 of them in use. So there are several of them, one for maternity benefits, for example, another one for child benefits. And so there's so many of them that are being used, but it's not very transparent how many are in use. But yeah.
It poses a lot of issues of accountability as well, because 60 systems to go after and to oversee it creates some challenges for any kind of attempt to oversee those systems, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
I'll try to move to Serbia, which is not in the EU, but have seen very similar developments in the past years. And A11 has been kind of trying to oversee this development, to monitor as a watchdog. Nadia, can you explain what is the social card system briefly,
yes.
and its origin?
Thank you, Chloe. Yes, and it's interesting to follow up now on Amnesty, because actually we used, our government used Danish model as a role model, because every time we hear something comes from Denmark in Balkan area, that's kind of a good thing, even though it's not always. So the digitalization...
We heard about the Brussels effect, now we have the Danish effect.
Exactly. So the digitalization of social protection welfare in Serbia started 2.5 years ago, in March 2022. by adopting the social law card and the register on social cards. And the proclaimed aim behind it, like a secret aim, let's say, was actually also to detect fraud. But the proclaimed aim in public was that we need a system to make a more equitable distribution of social benefits, and also to make Center for Social Work to make them more effective in a way. And this social card register actually connects and collects personal data from beneficiaries and from potential beneficiaries of social welfare system from relevant institutions to social welfare systems. So that means tax administration, pension and disability fund, central register for citizens. So all kind of personal data. There is around 135 of them, and not only from you, but also from persons who are connected to you, the law says, which means this is a really wide range of people, not only people who live in the same household, but also from like ex-partners, and yeah, so like a whole breach of privacy there. So the main thing is the income. So this register actually detects any kind of income you may have, and it classifies it as an income from employment. So we had cases which is actually a disqualifying criteria for social benefits. So that means if you have any kind of employment income, you're cut off from your social benefits, in the first place financial social assistance. So we had cases of people inheriting something, or people who had donations for example, for funerals of family members, or different things, because social benefits in Serbia are very, very low. So financial social assistance is around 100 euros, which is very low even for Serbia. And these people were usually doing some kind of informal work, but like waste pickers, or like very, very poor works as well. But now the register also detects this kind of income. So any kind of income you may have from any kind of origin, it counts as an employment income, and then you're being stripped off from your social benefits. And the register collects this data, sends a notification to your social worker that you have some kind of change in your social economical status, and then it also sends an instruction to social worker that what the worker has to do in this case, which is usually to terminate your right or to reduce it in a way. So to reduce it in a way. So that means it's not a proactive system at all. It only serves to kind of strip off people from their benefits. And we had, for 2.5 years of implementation, we had more than 45,000 people being out of the social welfare system, which is around 20% of beneficiaries. And that in practice means that every fifth person is being stripped off from their financial social assistance, and it's like against common sense to think that all these people are committing any kind of fraud, because the system only cares about statistical data. It doesn't care in like which household you live, do you have electricity, do you have water, do you have sick family members. It only cares about this income. So the problem here lies in the fact that the classification of income is wrong, and also sometimes it detects higher income than it happens in the practice, and people do not have any legal tool to fight this except for filing complaints, which is then a process of several months, and you live without any kind of income during this time.
Who has been mostly affected by this?
Mostly affected, so Roma communities, because they're overrepresented in the social protection system. So we can also talk about some kind of indirect racial discrimination here, but they are more than 85% of our social welfare system. So mostly them, but also people who live in extreme poverty as well. And this kind of digitalization in this kind of way only pushes people back and into more deep kind of poverty. And you cannot adopt this digitalization to a system that is kind of old-fashioned and that already has some existing problems. So in a way, all these problems from social protection are more emphasized now. And we have two laws to fight now, not only one social protection law, but we have also now social care law. So we are kind of challenging both these laws.
again, we need to connect both the underlying policy of austerity and social control and the kind of built in or built on top the layer of technology that is serving those objectives. I will turn now to Mr. Saliba, who has to leave a little bit earlier than before the end of this session. So I want to turn to you, and I want to ask you, basically, for your reaction as a policymaker in the European Parliament. Maybe for the audience, it's also nice to know, like, what is the competence of the EU in this field? Maybe it's not straightforward for a lot of people. Like, do we have competence to do something at EU level? And are you concerned about what you heard?
I'm definitely concerned. And the examples that have been brought from different member states and also countries who are outside of the European Union, I think they are common examples which you can find practically in each and every member state. And it's not only an issue about social benefits. I can bring a number of examples also from my member state, which is the smallest member state. So we have nearly complete digitalization of our public service, but at the same time, there is also human interference and one-stop shops when it comes to people who have no digital devices, no internet at home, so they can check physically when it comes to checking their status, education, health. So the system is accessible, but at the same time, one has also to look at digitalization and how it is affecting also, for example, the most vulnerable consumers in our society when it comes to telecoms. I have a number of case studies which for me are shocking. For example, the fact that a telecom operator, they give you two options. So they give you the automatic option. You have a bill for your mobile, telephony, television at home, your package at home. So they will tell you, okay, if I send you your bill by email, that's for free, it's part of the service. But if you don't have an internet connection, if you don't have an email address, if you don't have a laptop, a PC, access to this basic digital infrastructure, then you have to pay an extra €1 a month for you to get the bill, to know how much and have an itemized bill for what you're paying for. Now imagine going to a grocer or to a supermarket and they will tell you if you want a itemized bill, you have to pay an extra 50 cents or €1. So this is also an effect when it comes to digitalization and the effects on the most vulnerable. So the issue of data gathering, sensitive data, you told me, and you rightly mentioned that it's really complex when it comes to EU's competence in regulating also essential services. The EU regulates essential services which are cross-border from one member state to the other, and we have a number of legislations which were also negotiated and approved during the past legislature. For example, water, for example, essential infrastructure, which has an effect in more than one member state. But then in regulating these specific examples, which are in most occasions happening restrictively in different member states, but the systems are not joined, then it's more complex for the EU to intervene. But I think that during the last term, we had a very good example, and practically all the examples that you were mentioning have elements of social scoring. And the AI Act, I think, is a very good example that we have, which ultimately was a good example to fight against this Chinese social scoring model, which is ultimately being and was being implemented in a number of member states from job opportunities. So social scoring is not only, maybe it's more sensitive for the most vulnerable, those who are socially excluded, Roma communities. There it is more risky. But at the same time, it is also being used, and the most vulnerable are also being the most negatively impacted by this when it comes for job opportunities. So it was really important for us, and this was a big push that my political family did during the negotiations on the AI Act, to make it totally clear that when it comes to social scoring, this is not in line with our European values. So we can do something about all the issues that we have been mentioning and the very concrete examples, which are, because the digitalization is important. The COVID pandemic has enhanced digitalization because ultimately it was a social experiment when it comes to implementing new digital tools. So that's important. It saved a lot of jobs. But at the same time, we have to see also the negative side effects. And we cannot go in the direction of digitalizing everything, sticking with our 2030 targets of full digitalization everywhere. But at the same time, we know that around 40% of European citizens, there is variation from a number of member states when it comes to numbers of digital literacy, but the problem of digital illiteracy, digital vulnerability is there. And it's around 40%. So what are we going to do with that 40% of our society? And that is the job of our legislators, ultimately.
And the situation is urgent in that sense. Those 40%, they won't have the digital skills like tomorrow to actually enjoy their rights. So there is a need for a slight change at European level, right? In terms of guaranteeing a different access, alternative approach.
There is. And this is what we have also done, and I'm going to link also with some work that we have done in the European Parliament directly, especially in the only committee in the European Parliament which is a direct link between citizens and the European Commission and European Parliament per se, the Petitions Committee. Another example which is very common, and it is impacting the most vulnerable. I mentioned telecoms in my initial remarks, but financial services are also bringing a lot of challenges to the most vulnerable, to older people in our communities when it comes to access of banking services, for example. Again, this is an example that I can bring up from home, but I have also seen it here in Belgium. Whereby you have big banking infrastructures, as in big buildings, but ultimately no human interaction at all. And this is also creating a lot of barriers, for example, when it comes to accessing another essential service. Today, banking and financial services have become also essential services that you cannot do without. So in the Petitions Committee, we have urged the European Commission and also European Parliament on a horizontal, because this has to be tackled not only sector to sector, but this has to be tackled on a horizontal perspective. Ultimately, to see that although it's important, we have the Payment Services Directive, which is pushing in the direction of total digitalization of banking services, to have more transparency, more visibility of what is happening when it comes to transactions, but it's totally missing the point of vulnerability of people who don't have access to infrastructure. So there is a big gap. It's not only a small gap, but it's a big lacuna when it comes to our targets and how we are addressing the needs of the most vulnerable and those who have digital literacy issues or digital access, not only literacy, but basic access to digital infrastructure. So this was a report which was approved during the last legislature, which I piloted and pushed forward, which was approved, and it is urging the European Commission and also different parliamentary committees to take into account when pushing forward legislation, when pushing forward targets, when pushing forward initiatives, ultimately to see that there is a big chunk, 40%, within our communities, within our society, who are lacking the basic infrastructure, basic access to digital infrastructure.
Absolutely. So there is some work to be done. I want to give the floor to our co-speakers for an opportunity to react. Maybe Juliana or Swazik or Hélène, about like what the EU has done in the past. Are we going in the right direction? If you met Ursula von der Leyen in the elevator suddenly, what would you say? What would you say to her? Are we going in the right way?
I would say first, stop investing on border control, invest on the social. To begin with. I want to come to a point that I think has been recurrent in all the speakers' presentations, is that this is also leading to a huge stigmatization of people experiencing poverty. So it's not that it's just, there is the lack of infrastructure and the lack of resources, is this whole dynamics of creating extremely strong barriers and increased barriers make people really not very confident to access social benefits in the end. So it's not only about the technocracy and bureaucracy, but it's also about the stigma that goes with that. That increases then exclusion and put people in extreme poverty. I think, coming back to the question of relating, I think we agree with MEP. It's not about not having digitalization at all. It's about making sure there is an alternative to the offline. There is an alternative to in-person service. There is an alternative to people-centered approach that we should come back to case management. So for us, this would be the main request.
Thank you.
I have a comment and possibly a question, if I can ask a question.
Absolutely.
So I think the EU AI Act is a good first step to trying to regulate, for example, the high-risk systems such as the Utbetaling Denmark system. And I wonder, you mentioned social scoring and Article 5(1)(c) of the EU AI Act and the negotiation that occurred to try and...
Can you tell briefly what Article 5(1)(c) is about for those who don't know by heart the AI Act?
Yes, Article 5(1)(c) basically in summary says that there's a ban, a prohibition on the use of systems that score people based on behavior. But what I think is a bottleneck in that article is it's not clear whether fraud control algorithms or risk-based scoring based on fraud control algorithms amounts to social scoring. I know the association with social scoring is the association that's been placed in with systems such as the Chinese system that you mentioned. And I wondered when you mentioned that there were negotiations to try and ensure that there was no social scoring, or there was a ban of a sort of like Chinese kind of social scoring system, whether during discussions, there was also a discussion about whether fraud control algorithms are a form of social control, are a social scoring system, and whether you think that Article 5(1)(c) will be interpreted broadly enough to capture fraud control algorithms to prohibit their use in the future.
That's a tough.
There were discussions, yes, going in that direction. I was not part of the negotiating team when it comes to the AI Act, but I followed a number of events and also discussions in the Internal Market Committee, on which I am also a full member. Now we have to see when it comes to enforcement and the interpretation of social scoring, which for me, it's the widest term that we could have used in that particular article that you were mentioning. But for me, when it comes to very invasive and very personal information used by algorithms to make these risks, for me, if you would ask me personally, I think that they will fall under the ban of social scoring.
Thank you.
It's to be seen because there is a lot. It's true there is a lot of carve out in this prohibition. There is like a limit in time. It's like it has to take place over a certain period of time, for example, for it to fall within the ban. You have to prove that there is a detrimental treatment, an unjustified treatment, or that it leads to something that is unfair in a different context. So it kind of shifts the burden a little bit of proof of. So we have to see in enforcement stage, as usual with European texts, if they are fit for purpose or whether we need to change them. Swazik, you wanted to intervene again?
Yeah, I maybe have 2 points on the AI Act and on enforcement that I've been wondering about. The first one is on effective, meaningful transparency. For instance, we've seen that one of the first hindrances of assessing these algorithms is knowing that they exist. The EU AI Act provides for a database for at least high-risk systems, which a lot of them, well, some of them will be social benefit systems, but so it's a general question, but I'm just wondering to what extent this database is actually going to help us carry out the work, and to what extent also it's not going to end up, again, putting the burden on affected people and civil society to do this assessing work, seeing as regulators will also be overburdened. So it's more of an interrogation. The other challenge that I see in terms of implementation is the interpretation of significant oversight. So in algorithms, we've seen there's a discourse around it's not fully automated, and algorithms that benefit from a human in the loop can, if my understanding of the AI Act is correct, will not necessarily be considered as high-risk systems, or can at least be taken out of the high-risk system regime if there is significant oversight. And in the case of the French system, for instance, it's true that the inspector has final say about whether they're going to control a beneficiary even after seeing the list. But there is a big question mark as to what extent they're influenced by this list. And so I'm thinking this, and if you're not under the high-risk system regime, right, and it's not a prohibited system, there is significantly less safeguards, including, publishing the fundamental rights impact assessment and all of these things. And so I'm just wondering whether the implementation of the AI Act will take into account these very concrete challenges, and how it will do so in order for it to be an effective tool against these pitfalls that we've been seeing on the ground.
Again, we'll see at the implementation stage, but there is definitely some work to be done by civil society actors and other watchdogs on this issue. I want to finish with what we just covered, what can be done, or what is wishful to be done in terms of legislation at EU level. But there is, in the meantime, people who do take action to seek justice when those who are affected can no longer suffer the negative consequences. And I want to give the floor to Nadia and Louise briefly. We have 5 minutes left. I'm sorry for that. And I will let Alex jump off the stage into. Thank you so much for coming and for sharing your thoughts. I want to give the floor to Louise and Nadia because they did lead a mobilization. They did try to build coalition against those systems. I would like to know whether there was any positive effect.
Yeah, we last year in region Brussels, the local government intended to pass a law in order to frame all online or future online public services of region Brussels, okay? There is still in Belgium no legal framework when it comes to digitalization of public services, which also is a bit strange because they do digitalize but without any framework. So region Brussels say, we're gonna do it. And we were at EDRi because we've been working on these issues before. We said, okay, it might be a good opportunity to get or like what we're doing more visible and say, okay, stop. You now are gonna make a legal framework about digitalization, and we actually are saying for over 5-10 years that people are not ready, people are not accessing their rights through digital ways. So we made a broad coalition of local civic organizations, NGOs, active in defending people with disabilities, older people. It was a very broad coalition of over 50 local associations. We tried to impeach the law, but it was still taken in February.
It was still adopted.
Yeah, it was adopted. And
without this guarantee for an offline access, right?
yeah, and so what we did is we tried to have the guarantee that in this law that public services would have to guarantee an offline access. And it did an article that it should be an alternative to online services. That should be a desk or a hotline or mail, traditional mail. But then they completed this article, they added, okay, if the work for the public services is disproportionate in order to give these opportunities to an alternative, then it won't have to do it. So it allows the public services not to give the alternative if it becomes too much work for them. And also it gives the opportunity to give an alternative to this desk hotline mail, which is, I think, chatbot. So they will say, we put a chatbot, so it's enough. Obviously, it's not enough. So what we're going to do is that we just intended a legal action in the constitutional court in Belgium now against this article. So we are not asking to cancel the law, but this article in the law that allow.
But now you've been mobilizing, you've been organizing street protests. Now you're going to litigation.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
Exactly.
What did you do in Serbia?
So we try to challenge this issue from all different perspectives and all different levels, and we try to be the legal voice for the ones who are being the most marginalized. So I think daily we are submitting individual complaints for people who are successful at the end, but it's a long process of a couple of months of waiting for this process to end. We also submitted a complaint to the Commissioner for Protection of Equality because it is, in a sense, discrimination for the people who are within the social protection system. We did submit an initiative for constitutionality assessment 2 months after this law was adopted. And this initiative was supported by Amnesty International and also ESCR-net, which is a global network of organizations that are working in the field of economic and social rights. And they also submitted amicus brief, which is a joint legal opinion to our initiative. And finally, a couple of months ago, we also initiated a process before the World Bank, because it was actually the World Bank who financed this register of social card, not the law, of course, but the register. So we found a mechanism within the bank, an independent mechanism within the bank, and initiated a procedure of compliance review. That means reviewing the bank's policies with the project it funded. So far, all of these processes are ongoing. The Constitutional Court remains silent still. This is an ongoing process, international one. So we'll see what will happen in a way. I mean, at the end, it is a long way to go.
But you're trying through different channels, which is very interesting as a strategic choice to try different entry points. I like the fact that you mentioned the World Bank as the one providing funds for such rationalization of public administration in Serbia. It shows very much how all we've been discussing is really inherently about old power dynamics embedded in colonization and domination, and so that was really important throughout the topic. I think we're running out of time. I see you nodding. I wish we could have one last round because it's so rich and as a topic it's very wide. Please stay tuned. Follow all those organizations' work because we will continue to work on this topic in the coming years and start building coalition to, finally put on the table what matters for people, access, equity, non-discrimination, and so on. So thank you for listening, and I wish you a good rest of the day.
Sorry. It's already... For some of you that are part of a civic NGO, we are a coalition of organization. EDRi is part of it, EAPN is part of it, and we are now, we drafted an open letter to the European institution to guarantee offline access to essential services, and we look for signatories. We are already 500 organizations around Europe, and we will soon go to the European institution to give the letter. So please, if you are interested in to sign it, just come and have this folder with a QR code. It's very easy. Thank you. Thank you.